Thank you, Miss Wahidi. You have explained with great detail and data how the deteriorating situation in Afghanistan is unfolding, and your plea, your emotional plea for the rights of the women and the Afghan people at large as civilians. I hope the people you're addressing are listening, and I'm sure they will, because, like I said, this will eventually end up in the UNHRC's record and gives the more credence that an Afghan person is saying this and not some Western analyst. We have received a few questions, and I got a few questions through the Q&A, I got a few questions through the chat, and I even got a few questions through WhatsApp. Probably some people are not very familiar with using this tool. That's fine. We'll go to the questions. Before we go there, I would like to first of all thank you all the speakers for actually joining us on a very short notice, despite your busy schedules. I know for Dr. Saikal, it's of course very, very late. And of course for Dr. Jalali and Ms. Wahidi, it's very early. So still we got ourselves together. Again, my gratitude for you, to you for joining, and I'll move on to a few questions. I'll address them if they're addressed to the person, and then I probably also have a few questions myself. One question which I got through the chat, the first one is to Professor Saikal, is how is Pakistan's foreign policy towards the Taliban going to develop in the coming months, given the current tensions regarding the TTP and the disagreements surrounding the border? I assume by the border, it's meant the Durand line. So while you said in your speech, of course, that Pakistani intelligence agencies, they have Taliban as part of their proxy warfare, their foreign policy, how do you think that will develop in the coming months, given the tensions you have regarding the TTP in Pakistan itself?
Well, we've seen different phases. What happened before 15th of August was one phase, and what happened after 15th of August is a different phase and a different scenario. Before 15th of August, there was a lot of collaboration between a number of countries in the region, in particular Pakistan, China, Russian Federation, and Iran, to really see the departure of the US in a bloody way, in a defamed way, that they could prove to their own people and to the world community that NATO doesn't work, that the United States are a failure, that whatever they've done in Afghanistan is a failure. But then after that, once the US forces left Afghanistan and the NATO forces left Afghanistan, there's a different scenario. Do we have the same understanding between countries of the region? The answer is no. The relationship between the Taliban and Pakistan is different after 15th of August because the Taliban have come to power. And that reminds me, I just remember that in 1992, when Dr. Najibullah's regime collapsed and the Mujahideen came to power, the relationship differed with Pakistan after the victory to what it was before. And I can see a similarity. And also after 15th of August, there was a lot of media coverage around the world, and also research centers produced papers proving the strong link between the Taliban and the Pakistani intelligence services. So the Taliban heard a lot about this, the fact that they are puppets of the Pakistanis and this and that. In the lower ranks and files, I could see some reaction. You know that one is the leadership of a movement and one is the lower level membership. And they were stirred, they were emotional, they wanted to react to this, they wanted to do things to prove that they're independent, that they are not puppets of Pakistan. But then we saw very quickly a few visits of the head of ISI to Kabul. Within days, the head of ISI came to Kabul and helped the different factions of the Taliban come together and give birth to a caretaker government. Since then, Pakistan has been working with the different factions of the Taliban, making sure that they have them all together. But the important thing is the Haqqani network is the key one, which has got control over the security forces. And they've got strong linkages with the ISI, and they're the ones also who've got strong linkages with the Arab world and with the Gulf states. I can see that Pakistan is now going through the management of a different phase of its relationship with the Taliban. But as far as the relationship at the upper level is concerned, the leadership of the Taliban, the Kandahari faction, the Durrani faction, and the Haqqani faction, my feeling is that they've got constant relationship, constant contact with the leadership of the ISI. And although Pakistan is the civilian government is a bit busy at the moment because Umar Khan is going through his vote of no confidence, but it looks like the establishment is there, and you might, I don't know whether colleagues know about this, that they've established a cell within the cabinet of Pakistan. It's called the Afghanistan Inter-Ministerial Coordination Cell. It's like a cabinet. In my mind, although on the surface, that cabinet, that sub-cabinet or that cell has been established to assist Afghanistan, to assist the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan, but in reality, there is a strong representation, senior representation from all the key ministries of Pakistan in that cell. And the head of it is the National Security Advisor of Pakistan himself, who is answerable to the Prime Minister directly. They've been visiting Afghanistan quite a few times. Members of the cell are in constant contact with the Taliban administration in Kabul. It appears that somehow Pakistan is not happy about the world recognizing the Taliban. This is what they want to utilize the Taliban to wipe out the legal identity of Afghanistan around the world, to make sure we don't have a voice at the UN, to make sure our embassies and consulates are shut down, to make sure that Afghanistan doesn't have a voice and it could be administered through the government of Pakistan. I've been researching a little bit on this cell. Hopefully very soon I might have a lot to say about it. I'm not going to release all the information, but I know where they meet regularly, what's the agenda. I would like to release one piece of the agenda is to encourage the international NGOs to establish their headquarters in Pakistan. Those NGOs who wish to work in Afghanistan, they have been guaranteed security in Pakistan and a host of concessions encouraging them to establish their headquarters in Pakistan. I don't think at the upper level this relationship will be in danger. It looks like it's going okay, and Pakistan and the ISI has got enough decades of experience how to deal with this. So that's as far as that question is concerned. But I notice there's another question here that how does the UN deal with the Taliban, given Taliban caretaker government, given the fact that half of them are in the sanctions list of the UN, which is an important question. And as Dr. Jalali said, you know, that hello, we're dealing with the terrorists who are in the world, the blacklist of the international of the UN. This is the sanctions regime that the sanctions committee of the UN Security Council has got. They've had it for the past 23 years. Sirajuddin Haqqani is a key member in that list. Now, the fact that Dr. Bachelet and a host of other dignitaries around the world go and shake hands with this is in question. The point is, this man is not supposed to have guns. This man, the movement of this man is supposed to be monitored. Their caretaker foreign minister, who is flying around the world, he is in the list. I know that he received the exemption for peace purposes, that he could travel for peace purposes, not to promote the government of the Taliban, not to pretend that we're governing Afghanistan. He should be only allowed. I'm questioning tonight here or today here, if the caretaker, so-called Prime Minister of the Taliban in Beijing, well, I'm afraid he's in the blacklist of the sanctions regime of the Security Council. Is there an exemption for him to fly from Kabul to Beijing? Has China applied for an exemption? They could, and if the exemption is there for peaceful purposes, to promote peace, well, is he? Or is he gone to seek recognition for whatever they're doing in Afghanistan? This is why I'm saying that the sanctions regime hasn't been taken seriously. The monitoring of that has been poor. The regime has been politicized from time to time. You know that China is a strategic partner of Pakistan and it's a permanent member of the Security Council. And we've seen that firsthand, how things are being played. And we know how Russian Federation and how the US and the rivalries between the powers, how they come together, sometimes to completely politicize a technically very good sanctions regime, which is from time to time being put on the shelves. So yes, I mean, I don't want to talk too much about what the Taliban are doing. I want to talk a little bit within the system that we have, the international system. Why isn't it functioning? Since the Second World War, we've been building up the UN system, we've been building up the Security Council, the General Assembly, resolutions, and all of that. Why on earth? You see at the General Assembly, 140 so countries vote in favor of something. That's the majority of the member states of the UN. How come that resolution is not binding? And nobody cares about it. Well, this is the will of the international community. Why don't we take it serious? And a number of other, I mean, 1373 resolution of the Security Council, it's turned into a joke. You know, it's supposed to, if 1373 was taken serious in the case of Afghanistan, the movement of the Taliban should have been monitored properly, they should have been stopped, they shouldn't have had an office. If Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations was taken seriously, there shouldn't have been an office of the Taliban in 2013 in Doha, because that challenged the convention. According to the convention, an independent country can only have one representation in another country, not two. We had an embassy and we had the Taliban political office. So, you know, we need to really work with the international community. We need to take whatever we've been building since the Second World War, we need to take it serious. And we need to really bring reform. You know, we saw what happened in the Security Council when it came to the issue of Ukraine. There was no resolution because there was a veto. And then the issue went to the General Assembly. And then the General Assembly passed a resolution, right, in favor of Ukraine, criticizing Russian Federation. But then so what? Who's going to enforce it? All resolutions of the General Assembly are not binding. And these are some serious questions that we have to raise. If only the system, international system worked, we shouldn't have seen the takeover of Kabul by the Taliban, and we shouldn't have seen the Russian Federation attacking Ukraine. Obviously, the international system is not working. The international political system is not working. The international legal system is not working. The international economic system is not working. And the human rights system. So the time has come, I think, from the takeover of Kabul by the Taliban and from what happened in Ukraine, we need to take lessons. How to review the entire system that we've been building and the little pieces, you know, of this system. Why didn't they work? I stop at that.
Thank you, Dr. Saiko. We have a few more questions to you, but I'm going to mix them up with questions to Ms. Wahidi and Dr. Jalali. And you're absolutely right that members of the Taliban are on sanctions list, but they are, according to the UN regulations, they're only allowed to travel and get an exemption if they are going there for peace talks and not to promote their government or themselves. And there needs to be a check and balances system which checks when this exemption is given, like they flew in a private jet to Oslo, whether they actually went there for peace talks or whether they went there to gain recognition for their own government. That's a very interesting point. Then I'll go for, there are two questions, I'll mix them up to Ms. Wahidi. That is, one, is Taliban and TTP in Pakistan the same, or is there any difference in their ideology? And again, a subsequent question to that is, what's the role of Afghanistan's neighborhood, including India and Pakistan, for the betterment of Afghanistan and Afghans? And a subsequent question to you on that is, can you elaborate a little bit more on what your company, or what EFSAS seeks to achieve, and it works, how it works in practice on the ground? And of course, this is addressed to Ms. Wahidi, but I think anyone who could after that or wants to add something to it, they could. And then after this, I'll go to Dr. Jalali.
Thank you so much. I mean, for the first question about the TTP and the Taliban, which is in Afghanistan, I can only speak from a tech basis, and the information that we receive and what we observe is that the misinformation and the disinformation, which is coming from the TTP as well, it really doesn't differ. I think there's two different targets at hand, but the mentality and the wording is very similar. So I wouldn't say that there's a differentiation in the way that they are communicating their goals on the international platform. I don't see really a difference. We see the same behaviors and narratives that we saw in the late 90s. So that's something that we have observed through EFSAS and scrubbing the internet for reports that we later on confirm and verify. So in that context, I would say that there isn't much of a difference. As to our work, I mean, I tell this a lot to Afghans who ask me why I am working on this and not so many other, more imperative issues. And I think it's that we don't have the agency in Afghanistan, and we didn't have it for the last 20 years, even though we had billions of dollars at our helm, to have access to information. For example, in the United States, in the Netherlands, anywhere, when a government transitions to another, your basic framework of emergency information, access to information doesn't change. That is always there. Your 911, your emergency services, that isn't political. In Afghanistan, information is political. And that's what EFSAS is trying to fix, is to decentralize the access to information, because we've learned time and time again through the Karzai government, through the Ghani governments, that information is political, and Afghans have a fundamental right to information. It is part of the UN Charter for Human Rights, and we didn't see that through our government. So EFSAS, which is completely youth-led, is trying to mitigate that issue, where Afghans have a right to understand what's going on the ground. And right now we have 10 staff members who are in Afghanistan, who go through the internet, all platforms, Facebook groups that are based in Afghanistan, and look for reports. And then we begin the verification process. We work with security experts, we work with journalists, we work with whistleblowers to confirm those reports and send those alerts to our users. But it's not just limited to gunfire, explosions, things like that. We also send reports on earthquakes. We send reports on weather issues, highway blockages. I mean, this is information that I believe helps Afghans go by day to day. And if there is a new government, or if we see change in the government, I want to build that status quo for Afghans, that there are things that you have a right to. You have a right to understand what's going on around you. And perhaps in the grand scheme of things, it is not a humanitarian app, it is not a education app, but it is building subconsciously a status quo within the Afghan populace of, when the government comes next, I want to have access to basic information, city information. And that is just one thing that I'm trying to do to build a robust accountability process for my country. So that's the first thing. As to the process, like I said before, the main feature of the application is to send near real-time alerts to your phone. Right now, it's just smartphones, but we're working feverishly to move to SMS offline, because the demand is there, especially in Badakhshan, Herat, Nangarhar, of Afghans asking, I don't have a smartphone, I don't have money. for data, but I want to receive this information. So we're looking for donors, we're looking for funders to work with us, because this is an inherent need, especially if the Taliban turns off the internet. SMS is really our only way to get information to Afghans. So I'm hoping that I can use this platform as well to say that if there's anyone who can work with us to take ihtisab offline and work on SMS, that would be great. And as I did mention, and Dr. Jalili had highlighted, I am looking into education in SMS, and I have received people saying, you know, we should still fight for girls to go to school physically. I completely agree. Girls should be in school physically, but we also have to understand that we are dealing with a very compulsive, very unstable regime. And that means that we need to have other solutions to stop girls from losing another year of school, which they've already lost to COVID and this war. So it's not the best solution, but it is one of them. And there are so many people working in education as well. But I will leave it there. But I would just say that, you know, thinking innovatively, it doesn't have short-term, you know, fruition. You have to think long-term, and that's the gamble that I'm making with my company.
You're absolutely in your right to use this platform and every other platform to ask for support, to support this humanitarian, in my opinion, this humanitarian attempt you're making to do in Afghanistan to get people to information. And I hope the listeners, and later on when this will be published as well, will take note of that. Then I'll mix it up to a few questions to Dr. Jalali, and I'll mix it up a little bit because they seem to be a little bit, you know, the same or overlap each other. One is, you suggest the development of mechanisms that ensure the provision of humanitarian aid without providing support to the Taliban regime. How would this work in practice? And subsequent to that is, you've also talked about the normalization of the Taliban in the eyes of the international community or the West. How do you think that should be addressed? And what do you think could be the compulsions of the international community regarding this, this normalization?
Thank you so much. Regarding the first question, I think first and foremost, it's really important, as I mentioned in my talk, that donors fund groups working to defend the rights of women and girls in Afghanistan, including, as Ms. Wahidi mentioned, alternative education options for girls shut out of schools. At the very minimum, donors should ensure that no funding goes to support programs that exclude girls. For example, government secondary schools in provinces where girls are barred from attending school. But yes, I mean, don't punish all Afghans for Taliban abuses, right? So one of the ways was that, you know, the US administration, the Biden administration back in December announced that it would expand ways that aid groups can help the rapidly worsening humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan by allowing more organizations, including those that focus on providing educational support, to work in Afghanistan. That could perhaps lead to having groups pay teachers' salaries directly. And this is also a maneuver that would inject cash into the economy while circumventing Taliban-controlled government ministries. Another idea that was announced a while ago was cash airlifts, right? I mean, a lot of Afghans have been so desperate. You may have heard stories in the media being reported that people are selling their children. They're selling absolutely everything they have. And these are credible reports. And guess who, when a child gets sold by an Afghan family to feed the family, what children, what do you think is the gender of the children getting sold? It's almost always the girls who get sold. From the reports that we have seen, it's almost never that a boy child gets sold. No matter how desperate the family becomes, it's always a girl child. And typically what happens to that girl child is they get sold off to an older married man who's gonna do God knows what with that poor, innocent, vulnerable female child. So cash airlifts has been another one. But like I have mentioned before, I'm going to segue into the second question regarding normalization, because these two questions kind of go hand in hand. The international community, European Union, US, regional countries have really been working to normalize the Taliban. And I think that the compulsion is that there's this defeatist attitude regarding the Taliban, that they're the winners of the war on terror in Afghanistan, and US and NATO are the losers, and we should be magnanimous in defeat. And this is really a bitter pill that we have to swallow. And this is the reality, and there's no alternatives. And that defeatist attitude is really, really, I think, is what's pushing the idea that it's the Taliban, and that's it. We have to deal with them. And like Ambassador Saikal mentioned, you have to go to the root of the problem. The root of the problem isn't Pakistan, but Pakistan continues to be a major non-NATO ally. I've been extremely disappointed by certain countries that I once admired and no longer admire so much because of what they're doing, like Turkey. They have really been at the forefront of normalizing the Taliban, at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum, their President Erdogan, things like that. So I do think that it stems from this defeatist attitude, but I also think that this normalization also comes from the failure, as Ambassador Saikal so eloquently pointed out, the breakdown of the international system. I feel like the international community relinquished a lot of leverage and a lot of political capital in those Doha talks. And I feel like when the Trump administration decided to basically, conduct that surrender deal, everybody else kind of took their lead. Of course, I mentioned a bit about misinformation, why it's so important, right, to tell the world what the real Afghanistan is. And I feel like, it's becoming more and more of a challenge with all these draconian decrees. Ambassador Saikal also mentioned, Pakistan wants to end Afghanistan as a political legal entity. I feel like I'm watching my identity become erased from history. So I feel like it's also, my last point on this, I don't think that it's really dawned on the international community that they are very much accountable for normalizing the Taliban, and that has direct consequences for the Afghan people who don't have a functioning government, and at the same time that they don't have a functioning government that could, govern, protect the population, control the territory, and provide services. They're watching before their own eyes the international community basically imposing this terrorist totalitarian regime on them. So I feel that this is a major, major obstacle. But also something else that I didn't mention is that in the 20 years war in Afghanistan, the US and NATO and regional countries did show a tremendous amount of incompetence and lack of will. So we also see that in this normalization process. We see this defeatist attitude, we see the incompetence, and we see the lack of accountability. Because if you want to get the Taliban to behave like a government, you got to go to the root of the problem. And that's not with the Taliban senior officials. It's, with the Pakistani military establishment. So I'll leave it there.
And I want to actually build up on that, because I hear a lot in all your speeches, and that is Professor Saikal, that's Ms. Vahidi, and that's also Dr. Jalali, which we have also heard a lot in analysis around the Taliban takeover. There are some people who say that, the Taliban as an insurgent terrorist group could never have defeated NATO and America and fought for 20 years had they not been supported by the Pakistani military establishment. You also talk about the root cause to go there. So do you feel that, because the European Union, 30% of Pakistan's export is done with the European Union. I think $8 billion a year still go in aid from America to the Pakistani government, which eventually ends up, again, by Pakistani government, I'm talking about the military establishment, because I feel that civilians of Pakistan equally victims of the policies of their military establishment. So what do you think the international community, and this is to all of you, because you say the root cause lies in Pakistan. You also, Dr. Jalali mentioned that this is not an Afghan Pashtun organization. This is basically refugees. We have talked about that with some Afghans as well, who actually say that many who fled the Soviet invasion and went to refugee camps in Peshawar were actually trained and sent back to fight the Soviets as Mujahideen. So what do you think the world community, the international community should do? Should it sanction Pakistan? What should it do?
Is this for me or?
Anyone.
Well, yes, absolutely. Pakistan should be sanctioned. I have been vocal about that, but unfortunately, I do not see that happening. President Biden has mentioned on several occasions that Pakistan is much more important to the US than Afghanistan ever would be. Pakistan is, of course, always touting its status as a nuclear power. It has the 6th largest army in the world. It's a country of over 200 million people. So, even if it's not sanctioned, it has to be held accountable. I mean, over the past 2 decades, there was a Congress commissioned a bipartisan Afghanistan group that, all these recommendations to the U.S. Congress and to, the U.S. government. And throughout all those reports, they made the recommendation that you have to address the Pakistan problem, and until that is addressed, you're not going to be able to see any tangible change in Afghanistan, in terms of the Taliban behavior. So I think that a lack of political will and that reluctance to really hold Pakistan accountable is a serious issue. But absolutely, Pakistan should be sanctioned. And you have prominent South Asia scholars like Dr. Christine Fair, who have said that it's way past the time for Pakistan to be on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. So I really don't know how many more times it needs to be said, but we see a major disconnect between reality and the will of the international community to really show the political will to address this issue earnestly.
Let me just add something. You see, a report of the monitoring team of the UN Security Council, which came out about a month ago, and I made a reference to that report in my introductory remarks, clearly says that we now have a flow of terrorist groups from the region going to Afghanistan. It says that the son of Osama bin Laden has already been in Kabul. He's been meeting the leaders of the Taliban. We've got groups like ETIM from China. We've got groups from Uzbekistan. We've got groups from Tajikistan, all of them coming to Afghanistan. Some of them are waiting so the Taliban could issue them official passports so that they could travel around the world. They're receiving trainings, and there is a possibility that the Taliban may include them in their security forces, either in the Defense Ministry or Ministry of Interior or Intelligence. That has been discussed too. And as I mentioned earlier at the beginning, that there is a possibility, and we've seen signs of that according to this media report, that they're recruiting the orphans of the security forces of Afghanistan who fought against them and who lost their lives. Now they've left orphans behind. So they're recruiting them, trying to turn them into suicides. Now, given all of this, I can see that within the next few years, Afghanistan will turn into a breeding ground of terror, exporting terror to the Middle East, to China, to Central Asia, to Southeast Asia and the Pacific, all the way to Australia, and to Europe, and back to the United States. Now, why we have such a situation? Because I'm not saying that that's the only factor, but it is a key factor. Pakistan's policy of using violence in pursuit of strategic objectives. I don't want to go to the history of that. We don't have time here, why they've adopted that policy. But we have to ask ourselves what motivates the Pakistani military establishment to adopt such a policy. I personally believe it's got a lot to do with tension with India. It's got a lot to do with lack of confidence between Pakistan ever since it's been born and the neighboring countries, and the tension within inside Pakistan between the military and the civilian government. And we see it right now. We see it. It's on the stage. What's happening in the Pakistani parliament. So we've been ignoring these factors for a long time, and therefore I think ideally, naturally, we need to really address them. We need to put them on the table. We need to address them. If we don't, this state sponsorship of terror is going to destroy the world. We've studied, you've seen the UN Charter. It's definitely jeopardizing the peace and stability and security of our region and of the planet Earth if we're not careful about it. To see a terrorist group to take over a country in front of the world, the eyes of the world, and within the international system, and a terrorist group signing an agreement with the United States of America with the presence of some 20 foreign ministers and the UN representative in Doha. All these things is happening. How come? So naturally, just what to do about it, it is very clear that we need to really address the issue. Under Article 41, 42 of the UN Charter, we need to open our eyes. We need to see that it is happening. It is happening.
Would you actually therefore say that this, two questions. One is, you say it's going to spread. You talked about the tensions between India and Pakistan. Do you also feel that that because a lot of people from Kashmir have joined, do you feel that Kashmir are also looking towards a very violent future because of this terrorism spreading towards that region as well? And secondly, do you feel that this war on terror ought to have been fought on Pakistani soil and not Afghan soil?
Well, number one, there's a symbiotic relationship between the Taliban and all the terrorist groups. And let's not forget, before there was Al-Qaeda, before there was Daesh, before there was Boko Haram, before there was Al-Shabaab, there was the Taliban.
There were the Lashkar-e-Taiba, there was the Jaish-e-Mohammed.
Lashkar-e-Taiba, all of them. Before all of them, there was the Taliban, laying the foundation of terror. And turning Afghanistan into a platform where they could come, they could receive training, and they could go back to their own homes and creating all kinds of problems. So right now that they control Afghanistan, according to themselves 100%, although that's doubtful, we're beginning to see spring has come. You might have heard that yesterday the resistance group captured a part of a province in Baghlan. So my feeling is very soon there will be groups in different parts of the country against the Taliban, which is worrying too from one perspective, because we need to coordinate. If we don't coordinate the resistance groups against the Taliban, it's going to be chaotic too. You know, the leadership has to be a unified leadership. Yeah, so definitely right now, the climate is ready for the growth of terror and all these terrorist groups. I mean, don't quote me, go and read the UN report. I mean, there's a strong team of monitors, some 10 of them. There's a lot of money going towards this. They monitor all these activities, and they've produced a report monitoring the activities of Al-Qaeda and Daesh in Afghanistan and the connection between them and the Taliban. According to that report, a host of terror groups have gone to Afghanistan. Right now, they're talking with the Taliban, they're receiving training, and God only knows what are their agendas, what they do in Central Asia, what they do in Tajikistan, what they do in Uzbekistan. Why on earth international terrorists have gone to the northern part of Afghanistan you know, according to the Tajikistan president and according to independent sources, there are at least 6,000 terrorists along the border with Tajikistan. And all these suicide brigades that the Taliban have been putting together, what are they for? For the people of Afghanistan to come and commit suicide again?
Okay.
So, you know, I mean, anybody who has got a bit of sense and it could open up the eyes can see that something big is in the process of making. And if we're not careful today, we will be regretting tomorrow. I noticed some time ago there was this AUKUS, you know, between the alliance between Australia and UK and the United States taking care of so-called security of the Pacific. They call it Indo-Pacific now. Well, I'm afraid we're in the mouth of the Indo-Pacific. You know, so what happens in Afghanistan doesn't remain in Afghanistan. Very soon it will go around Afghanistan, it will go to Central Asia, it will go to South Asia, it will go to China, it will go to the Middle East, it will go to Europe, and it will come back to New York and to Washington, D.C. Now, you know, fair enough, we have got our own share too in this failure in Afghanistan. We've had corruption, we've had, you know, ethnic agenda in our government. We've had weaknesses of all sorts. There was election rigging, there was fraud in the elections that we had. So yes, we've got our own homeworks, you know, we Afghan politicians and so-called civil activists and a lot of us. But at the same time, it's the responsibility of the region and of the international community and this international system to be fully mobilized to take care of this.
Okay. Moving on, there's one question from someone: how can I help and contribute to Afghanistan's betterment? Well, the answer to that is please get in touch with Dr. Jalali, Dr. Mahmoud Saiko, and of course, Miss Sarah Wahidi. You can support her app and her company, which provides life information and fights disinformation. Ms. Wahidi, to you with this question, your app is called Atasab. That means holding accountable or accountability. Going further on this question where Dr. Jalali talks about the root cause and Dr. Saiko also talk, is your Atasab holding accountable the root cause, or is it Atasab of the current government? Who are you wanting to hold accountable?
Well, I mean, the first draft that I had of Ihtisab as a platform actually was in 2018, just before the parliamentary elections. And when I was observing the problems that we were seeing day to day, I thought perhaps it's because people aren't making an informed vote. Because when I was getting ready to vote, my father told me, you have to vote for my friend. And that's usually what Afghans do. They support their clan member, they support their tribe, they support their elder uncle. And that's not an informed vote. And what I was thinking was I would build this platform where you could connect with those running in parliament, candidates, and ask them, what are you passionate about? What will you serve me as a representative to begin? So for me, I always believe that there are these nuances in our society that you kind of need to target in very indirect ways. And that's how I've always strategized my work in civic technology. And unfortunately with the elections, there was not time to do that. But for me, it's decentralized. I think it's keeping anyone accountable. During the previous government, Kabul municipality, we were posting about all of the issues we had with sanitation, with road blockages, with traffic. So we were keeping Kabul municipality accountable. And then at the same time with the previous government and failures in security. And on top of that, at the same time when the Taliban was attacking Kabul city, posting those explosions, posting attacks, and I wondered to myself that I wish Ihtisab had existed during the attack of Kabul University. To have had this platform for students where we could have alerted them, those students who were being killed at the entrances. We could have sent an alert saying this is happening, to have let them know. And Afghans have never had something like this. So for me, it's keeping anyone accountable. And I think that since it is youth-led, my entire team, we come from every corner of Afghanistan. It is a collective tool that we all own. And I want to make sure that Afghans understand that Ihtisab and a lot of other startups, it is for you. We are non-governmental, and that's the beauty of startups and technology, is that it's decentralized. So for me, it's providing this tool, and to remind Afghans that, you know, you can access information and we can hold those accountable, but you need to be a part of that process. It can't just be, you know, I'm just kind of looking on the sidelines. And I think that that's why we have this issue. The governments, all of them in the last 20 years have kept Afghans in the dark. And that's why we have had rampant corruption. That's why we have had this centralized government, is keeping Afghans in the shadows. And I'm hoping that as years go by, I still stick to this mission, that I want to make as many processes transparent to Afghans. And when there is a government, they will know what to advocate for. You can't advocate for something if you don't know what you can have. And with Ihtisab, perhaps it's not the answer, but people will say, okay, we need a 911 number, a robust emergency line that is always active no matter which government is in place. So these things, when Afghans see them and they ask questions and they engage in dialogue, is, we never had this before and now we want it. So I think that that's how I approach Ihtisab. And also, if people ask me, why didn't you use a Dari or Pashto word? Because I didn't want any group to say this is with a certain language or affiliation. By choosing something completely outside of the country, Afghans make Ihtisab whatever they want it to be. And I think that that's the approach we need moving forward, is to move beyond the paradigms of ethnicity and tribe, and, you know, to come together collectively, because this is what's destroying us, and this is what's allowed regimes like Pakistan to come in and find our weak points. So, you know, I agree with Ambassador Saikal that, you know, this is a time to collectivize and come in together, and especially with the resistance. There are obviously a few Pashtun resistances as well, and I was reading a thread about that yesterday on Twitter, and these all need to come together. Decentralizing these resistance movements is just going to hinder everything. So I hope that they do see the ambassador's message as well, that this is the time to collectively work together and mobilize.
But I know that Dr. Jalali soon has to leave because she has a class, but I wanted to ask one question which she can answer first, and then the others can answer. And that is a pretty peculiar question, so I'm going to choose the right words. But what I would like to know is how Afghans, you people, you Afghans, have felt during the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine and the world's reaction to that, comparing that with the reaction to effectively establishing, legitimizing, and giving a whole country on a platter to a terrorist organization, while the Russian invasion of Ukraine has evoked a lot of emotional reactions in Europe and in America. People have opened their homes for refugees. People are actually driving to the border of Poland and Ukraine from countries like Belgium, Netherlands, and Germany to pick up refugees and give them refuge in their own homes. I know that Denmark had this very controversial law that every refugee who would come in would have to give up their jewelry and whatever assets they had. But this particular law was put on hold for Ukrainian refugees. So let me try to be civilized but still blunt. How do you as Afghan feel? Do you feel equally treated, equally human? What has it done to you?
Yes, so I think everybody might have seen, there's been a lot of racist media coverage of the Ukraine war. Journalists have said things like, well, we don't expect war in a civilized European country like Ukraine. So there has been a lot of Orientalist attitudes, racist attitudes. Even a very senior, a former French ambassador to the UN said, well, we feel closer to the Ukrainians because they're European. You know, it's not good, but that's how it is. So I feel like there's been a lot of, I mean, it has really exposed the reaction to the war, the Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed a lot of, barefaced racism. So a lot of it is that. But I also think, because for me, it's been a bit of a deja vu, because as a 5-year-old, when the Soviets rolled in their tanks to Afghanistan, Russia was one of the first words I remember uttering as a child. I do feel that to some extent that a lot of the people in the international community feel that, well, the international community did invest in Afghanistan. And I feel like there's a consensus, unfortunately, and we Afghans do bear responsibility for this, that Afghanistan is a failed state to a large extent because the Afghans have failed to show leadership. Their leaders have. And I would have to say very bluntly that there's some truth to that. So we do bear some responsibility for that. There was 20 years of engagement, all this money was spent, and we could talk about all the mistakes that were made by the international community, the failure to address Pakistan. But the corruption, the ethnic strife, I also feel that we Afghans can do a better job of developing a sense of civic culture and civic responsibility, a love for nation. I, for one, saw too many Afghans going and, just being more self-interested. But absolutely, there are double standards for sure. And that has been very much seen in the different reaction to not only Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the situation in Ethiopia. So it is hurtful. You do feel like, I mentioned this in the early days after August 15th, that as an Afghan, I feel like I have no friends in the world. There's not one country that I could look to right now and say, well, this country cares. Even India, our historical friend, has been a disappointment in some ways. So it is hurtful. It's very, very tough, especially when I, as an Afghan, feel like I'm witnessing the erasure of my identity. So I would say, for me, there is hurt, but I also feel as though people are just kind of tired of dealing with Afghanistan. I don't want to hear about Afghanistan. They don't know how to run a country. I do think there might be a bit of that as well. And I do think that we have suffered a lot because of our predatory neighbors, because of great power politics, but we also have to, do some, a bit of soul searching as well.
And do you feel that, you talk about historical friends, you talked about India, do you feel India could have done more?
Well, yeah, I mean, because immediately after August 15, 2001, I saw senior Indian diplomats, senior Indian political officials really, dealing with the Taliban as a matter of a fact attitude when, as Ambassador Saikal mentioned so eloquently, what the Taliban do in Afghanistan is not going to stay in Afghanistan. It's going to spread. And I was really surprised by the lack of alarm to that. Even a country like India, which of course knows far too well the impact of regional instability emanating from Pakistan. So I feel, it goes hand in hand with what I've been saying throughout my talk, this normalization. When even India is sort of normalizing them, then you know that the problem is very, very grave. But I will admit that it's multifaceted. As much as we have to hold the international community accountable, we have to hold Pakistan accountable, but we also have to look within ourselves as well, because there have been some failures at our end as well. And that's just the cold hard truth.
Okay, I believe you will leave us soon. If you can stay, please do stay. Yeah, the same question actually, while it's heartwarming that Europe is of course opening up their doors for Ukrainian refugees, the double standards, how do you feel as an Afghan actually to both of the other speakers?
Well, I mean, I would like to give a chance to you, Mr. Wahidi. Do you want to go ahead?
Go ahead.
I listened to the explanation of President Putin for the invasion of Ukraine. And fair enough, he's got grievances, and also it doesn't have a lot to do only with Ukraine. It's got a lot to do with the global security architecture, you know, what's the US doing, what's NATO doing, and how it's been evolving in the past few decades since the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And it's a reaction to that. But I still believe it's an overreaction. I think to launch a full-scale invasion of that magnitude, it's overreaction. And to see the distraction of the built environment. You know, obviously, a city like Kiev and other cities, they have been rising up over the centuries. It's not only a matter of a few decades or a few years. And to see the refugees from Ukraine, millions of them in the space of 1 month, it's too much. But for me, it just took me back to the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan when I was a teenager. I had just finished high school and I had just entered university when the Soviets occupied Afghanistan. And to see the young Russian soldiers on their tanks coming to Kabul, the same age as I was, it was a big shock for me. And of course, and to see the resilience of the Ukrainians to stand up, you know, for their country. All of that, and my feeling is it's conveying a message to the people of Afghanistan too, you know, that you can stand up for your country. Whatever the plot was, whatever, you know, how the power was surrendered to the Taliban and all that, it's still our youth are eager to stand up to the Taliban. And of course, when I say stand up, I don't mean armed struggle, right, you know, as a first mean. The first mean is political opposition, civil opposition, making sure that we bring the Taliban to the negotiating table so that they could genuinely come and negotiate the future of the country. And as far as the international community is concerned, they have to wait until Taliban receive national legitimacy. No matter what the world does, my experience, you know, we've seen this roller coaster a few times of, you know, regime changes and all that, and the country being occupied and all that. It doesn't matter what China does. It doesn't matter what the US does. It doesn't matter what the Russian Federation does. It doesn't matter what Pakistan does. At the end of the day, if you do not enjoy legitimacy inside Afghanistan, there's trouble. So we need to really focus on that. We see the need, an urgent need for an Afghanistan-wide conference between the various factions, the various politicians, all stakeholders in the domestic politics of the country. Before we think about the region, before we think about the global architecture. Naturally, we've got players. Naturally, you know, we've got regional players, global players. We've got a lot to do with the life of Afghanistan. But it looks like we need to really do our bit, and then we need to talk to the region, and then we need to look at the rivalry, global rivalry between the major powers and all that, and make sure that we have a sense of good coordination so that we could get out of this mess in Afghanistan. But in the case of Russian Federation and Ukraine, the good news is, you know, as a diplomat, I studied a lot the conflicts elsewhere around the world, that from day 3 of this conflict, of this aggression, they have had bilateral meetings, negotiations, and they've maintained that. And I can see that they've progressed. I've got a feeling, I don't want to be too optimistic, but soon they may reach a peace agreement. And already Ukraine is indicating, you know, that it's moving away from NATO. It's thinking of a neutrality of some sort and all that. So my feeling is that if they keep that bilateral, direct negotiations away from the third party, this is the mistake we did in Afghanistan. We brought any Tom and Dick and Harry in this negotiation. And anybody who comes in, you know, at the UN, there's a formula that the best solution to a conflict is to deal with it at bilateral level. The minute you bring a third party and a fourth and a fifth, then they come with their own agenda and with their own interest, and it becomes very messy. So in the part of Ukraine, my feeling is that there could be a peace agreement soon, and hopefully things will settle. But to rebuild Ukraine is a nightmare. They need international support, and what we've been through this a couple of times. I've been through it a couple of times during my lifetime. So it will take some time. But also in the part of Afghanistan, I think there is an ethnic agenda that we need to address, this issue of ethnicity. In the internal politics of Afghanistan, that needs to be addressed, and we need to overcome this, and we need to really see the 40 million population of Afghanistan as citizens of the country. And I need to really appreciate what Wahid is doing with the EFSAS system and all that. I mean, these are the bits and pieces of building up a nation, or building up a system that we desperately need. But we need to address this issue that, you know, the 40 million people of Afghanistan should be seen as citizens of Afghanistan, as nationals of Afghanistan, enjoying equal rights. I think this is something that we need to do. This is our homework. But then we need to talk to the region. We need to address the Pakistan issue, and then, of course, we need to make sure that, you know, we take the rivalry of the major powers away from Afghanistan. Now, with the UN, we were pushing a concept of turning Afghanistan into a platform of cordiality for all, for the neighbors and for the countries beyond the region who've got legitimate interest in Afghanistan. Given our sensitive location, where we're sitting at a highly sensitive part of the world between Central Asia, South Asia, the Far East, and the Middle East. So we cannot afford to lean too much towards a major power. History stands, you know, in there and says that that's not the right thing to do. Whenever we managed our neutrality properly, we've survived. Whenever we fail to manage it properly, there is been trouble.
No, thank you, Ms. Wahidi. Would you like to say something on that?
Yeah, one point that I absolutely agree with Ambassador Saikal is that, I mean, I think one of the most gross mistakes that we made during the peace process, and I think that Ashraf Ghani had made, was not being the face of Afghanistan during the peace talks. Because when the Taliban was reverting their behavior, there was a president there who could have said, I was face to face with you. I was a part of those peace talks. And because he decided not to, because he didn't want to legitimize the Taliban, at that time, they weren't legitimate. They were just a militia group that was attacking Afghanistan. He was the president. If he had sat there and looked at them straight in the eye instead of sending a random, delegation, it would have been easier to keep the Taliban accountable. But because he wasn't there, everything fell apart. And exactly what the ambassador had just said about being a yin of Afghans, that just collapsed, because what it showed was that even the president wasn't able to keep his country at the helm, which now that I think about it in retrospect, is something that really led to the failures of the peace process and the responsibility of Afghans in that, and our failure in that context. But of course, with Ukraine and Russia, I mean, I'm not surprised at all. We have seen the media and the way that they evoke the Afghan versus the Ukrainian, and it is that, reporters are saying these are blue-eyed, blonde-haired children, and they are not the Syria, they are not the Afghanistan. And, this is what Orientalism is. This is exactly what we have been facing from time immemorial. This is not shocking to anyone. And what Dr. Jalali had said just before she left, I feel the same. I was speaking at one of the largest tech companies in the world a few weeks ago, and a man had told me in a Q&A that I am sick and tired of Afghanistan. It is your fault. It is your country's fault. And I hope that the international community doesn't step foot in that country again. This is what the international community, this is what the international populace believes. They are just exhausted from Afghanistan. And I think that this is why we need to take accountability of our country, because no one else is going to come. There is no more 2001 overthrow of the United States. I think the last thing that could ever happen is the United States ever returning to Afghanistan, even if there was, like the ambassador had just said, this cesspool of terrorism which is growing in Afghanistan. No one wants to deal with it, and they would rather it just flourish out of that country. And even though it is affecting other countries, I think that there will be so many narratives that will be built about, look at the loss, look at how much money we wasted. Okay, there is some terrorism, but was it worth staying in that country? And I think that a lot of the global community might agree with that and say, you know what, if there is terrorism flourishing in Afghanistan, let it be. That's just how it's always been. And I think we need to come to terms with this narrative. And it's embarrassing, I think, as an Afghan, because, we've always relied on aid development, and it has to stop here. And I think until the Afghan population comes together and collectively says this needs to end and we need to rebuild, that's when we'll see change. But for now, I think that we need to come to terms with what's happening. And I think the last thing that I'll say is, I yesterday was in a lecture with a very prominent Arab scholar named Sultan Al-Qasimi, who was doing a presentation about Arab art, and it was full of Arab students, pan-Arabism, of them being so proud of their culture. And I would also say to the ambassador and to our leading intellectuals, to our leaders, to meet with the next generation, to show them the beauty of our country, because we see it with the Arabs who are, priming their next generation of, this was our history, this is what we're proud of. And, the youth needs to see our leaders. If it wasn't the president, who is now gone, it needs to be these prominent leaders, our ambassadors, our scholars, to say, don't forget where you came from. Don't forget what you need to be proud of. And we don't have that. I don't have that at Columbia. We don't have that at Harvard, at Yale. So we need leaders like the ambassador to remind us what we need to fight for, because we're forgetting that. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I think, if I may be so free to suggest, I think your next app could be called Ittihad, Unity, which you could work towards, like the ambassador suggested. And you're absolutely right. There is this in South Asia, if I may include Afghanistan fully in South Asia. We have this tendency of wanting to be someone else. We have this tendency of either relating ourselves with the colonial times, the white person. And if looked at in terms of religion, we have this tendency of wanting to become Arabs, while we are South Asian Muslims, which have their own history, their own culture, and they might share a religion with the Arabs, but we are certainly not Arabs. And that's something we ought to be proud of. Like, coming from Kashmir, there's a huge history of Afghanistan which we are taught there, and probably the same goes for, I know from a lot of Afghan friends that they have this mythical love and connection with Kashmir, while we in our own places know very less about our own places. So yeah, we could go on a few more hours, but I think Professor Saiko, it's getting late for you as well, and we have kept you for long, but hopefully.
Okay, I'm still sleeping Kabul time.
Okay.
So in Kabul it's probably 8 o'clock in the evening, so I'm okay.
Good. No, so we are again. We hope we can do this again, maybe a one-on-one interview someday, so that you can express your views even more. I hope you enjoyed it. I want to thank you very, very much for joining us. We will now go on publishing this and putting it to the UN as well. And you will, of course, receive a few links from me in the coming days. I want to thank you very, very much. And if there is anything you want to conclude with, please do so.
No, thank you very much. I want to thank you, and I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank Shahjan, the Swahidi, and Dr. Jalali, and your foundation for making this happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much again to your organization and to the ambassador and to Dr. Jalali. It has been an absolute honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. See you next time.
Bye.